We invited the BBC chef Valentine Warner here at Habits by Republica to talk with us about food waste. But maybe the biggest lesson we've learned from this conversation was the link he made between food and love. In the next few minutes, I invite you to listen to this extraordinary conversation my colleague Alexandra Gătej, creator of Habits by Republica program, had with Valentine Warner. Enjoy!
Dear Valentine, well, thank you for accepting to have this conversation with us today about the importance of food, the relationship of people with cooking and nature in the same time. You're clearly someone very, very deeply involved in cooking, but also in relationship to food and to nature. These are significant and very personal topics to you, and they are very obvious in all the books you wrote, in the shows you have produced for BBC, for Good Food and others, and in your entire work. You are promoting a certain philosophy of living and eating on this planet that is not at all mainstream. There's something in one of your books and in the conversations we just had in recent times, where you say food is nature brought indoors. It's something I really, really like. And therefore, your convictions, the way I hear them, are very, very strong. You really care about passing them to other people. And it's almost like you address a wake-up call for humanity with your strong convictions. At least that's how I read them. You do touch upon very, very serious topics such as food poverty, such as food anxiety, rationing as opposed to wasting, packaging, the false abundance pressure of having a lot of food and a lot of cheap food, as well as the importance of understanding nature in order to understand food. These are topics that are not really discussed in my country, in Romania, and some of them, like for instance rationing, which I know, and food boxes, which I know you're passionate about, are quite taboo here, given our long years of food scarcity literally, and not just as an ideological choice. So the reason why we wanted to have this conversation today is very much related to food waste and the topics surrounding this huge problem, but also because of the way you do tackle all these concerns. In a forceful way, but also with a strong and humanistic sense of responsibility. So before going to food waste and all the topics around it, I'd like to ask you to explain for us something you say in your book, The Consolation of Food, and that is, if you can't cook, you're not a grown-up. What do you mean by that?
I guess what I mean by that is that, you know, when my children are grown up and they go out into the world, the idea that they might go to university or not and not be able to cook, cooking is a very basic function. It's about sustaining ourselves. It's about sustaining other people or loving them in many cases. Food is an offer of love, apart from it. So it's something that we all need to be. You don't have to like cooking, but we all need to know how to cook. Cooking engages us with the wider world. Cooking, you know, by cooking, you know more about what's around you. You have more choices. You have more control. You understand, ideally, the natural world around you. So I would say that if you can't cook, you know, you aren't grown up. This is something that we all need to know how to do. And, you know, if sometimes I think if you kind of took, you know, the modern man out of the city, maybe let's say London, you took 1,000 people and you put them on an island which was covered in food, running around or growing, I think a lot of those people would still starve because they simply don't know how to, you know, feed themselves. And so that, you know, very straightforward. If you can't cook, you're not grown up. You're not a grown up.
That's a very striking opening. It's a perspective I've not heard so far, but it's also very, very clear. It becomes very, very clear. You also say,
well, I guess also, as you know, as a child, you know, children need feeding. You know, they can't feed themselves. So presumably the move from child into into adult is an ability to be able to feed yourself.
You also say something very, very interesting as well. Well, everything you say is interesting to me. You also say people living in the cities cook less and less, also because they have no knowledge of nature. And if they have no knowledge of nature, you then say, then they cannot understand food. In the same time, we observe that people claim one of the reasons why they don't cook and why they don't eat together anymore is that they have no time while sitting 6 hours a day on Instagram. So what has happened,
I think what has happened, that's a big one to answer because there's many parts to it. But I think it's by no fault of our own that in a sense evolution moves forward and we travel with it. It's very hard to go backwards. But sometimes we see the value in going backwards when we see the mistakes that surround us now. I think certainly what's happened in this country is that if you go back not so long ago, that people would live, in their areas, in their regions, maybe coastal or in forests or wherever. And you would very rarely go into a big town unless, maybe not even in your whole lifetime, unless to kind of sell something or, perhaps find a wife, I don't know. And so people really understood the areas they were in. They knew when things grew. They knew how to raise a pig. They knew how to kill it before the winter came. And they knew how to preserve things. As we've all drifted towards the cities, that connection with the countryside has been lost. We no longer need to know when the herring runs or, where the nettles grow, because you move into a city structure where there are eating houses and people are making stuff for you. And very quickly, that information disappears. It's not necessary anymore to survive. There's so many other ways of getting food. What I've noticed in my travels, that where you see a very strong food culture, where you see a real pride in food culture, is places which are remoter. That could even, still be, the rot is setting in already, but, parts of France, parts of, as close as Italy, but then, when I've been with the Sami or in, the First Nations in Canada, where you have quite often poverty, where you have remoteness, you tend to have a much greater understanding of food. And it might be very simple food because those regions become known for a few specific things, but people know how to use them in many ways. There's far more reliance on wild food as well, especially somewhere like Transylvania and Romania and, and so, yeah, it strikes me maybe too simplistic an equation, but the remoter the population, the stronger the food culture. The minute you start drifting back towards cities, it's where you start to have problems.
So this is one of the keys of how this can be fixed, for people to pay attention to what has been in the past, the lessons of food.
I think sometimes, yeah, the past is, has a lot to teach us. But then, post-war, certainly in this country, the kind of, the race for, kind of big, commercial farming, industrial farming, and it's caused many, many problems, as we're all seeing all over the world now.
So is there any connection, just continuing on this line of thought, is there any connection, you think, between knowing how to cook and food waste? In other words, if you know how to prepare your food for you and for others, would you say that you start to appreciate more where it comes from? Is there a relationship here?
I think it's very difficult for me to answer because I'm a chef, and I'm a chef who's very interested in nature. I would say that, to stand still and, and see what's around you, quite often for me writes the menus. But that's, based on a lot of books that I, and a lot of living in the countryside, things that I've learned over ages. The problem is, you mentioned time. It's everyone, saying, I don't have the time to cook. You see these cookbooks, recipes in 30 minutes, recipes in 20 minutes, recipes in 10 minutes. Why is this happening? Some of the simplest things hardly need any attention, and you can kind of go off and do something else. But we're all sitting around watching Netflix or playing around on our phones, yet we have no time to do this thing, which is so much about family, about getting everybody to sit down together not grazing whenever you want, but come on, let's be a family. Let's discuss things. And of course, you know, it doesn't take long to cook a piece of fish. It doesn't take long to make an omelette. It doesn't take long to prepare a salad. But people, you know, I would say some people can't even cook, you know, who wouldn't even know how to go about making an omelette. So it's this kind of this race to have more, to spend more time on screen, and if that happens, if you are totally beholden to your food, you know, just, you know, arriving, then how can you protect the place where food comes from? Because I think, you know, above waste, above everything, you know, if we ravage nature, which we're already doing, if, you know, without nature, we can't be here. So it seems like, you know, a huge subject from one end to what you're asking me to go back all that way. But yeah, gosh, you've got me in a pickle already. But time, you know, we do have the time to cook. You should have the time to cook. It's an act of love. It's an act of, you know, sustaining yourself and your family. And what is this rush that we're all in, that food has taken, you know, been relegated to something unimportant? Because if it's unimportant, then my God, we're going to have a lot of environmental issues because you don't know what's going on.
But have you always been mindful about nature ravage and about food waste, or is it something you have experienced as an adult? Because
well, to know about food is an ability to not waste. If you know, it was Magnus Nilsson, the great cook at Faviken, who said to me one day, Val, you know, what do you think about having a meat license? There'll be a practical and a written exam. And I said, well, good luck getting that passed, but I think it's an amazingly good idea. You know, now I think, you know, as food has become very cheap, lots of the things that we used to eat, which were, you know, which were eaten by, you know, the poorer people, basically, you know, when you could have all the nicer cuts, then why did people want to eat that stuff anymore? We don't want those things. We want to eat what you're eating. The problem with that is that you can say it's about, you know, there are so many parts to a pig. You know, you have the tail, you have the ears, you have the kidneys, you know, there's so many, you know, there's the cow and its tripe, you can eat the muzzle, you can boil the tongue. You can, you know, even when you peel an apple, if you put all the, you know, the peel in the oven with some sugar and cinnamon on it and crisp it, you can, you know, there's so many things. And we all throw, you know, the tops of radishes, carrot tops, you know, there's so many things that you can eat, but people don't know about these things anymore. And we've become very squeamish as everything's been done, or it's all been, you know, the best bits, or it's all been portioned for us. So you don't know it's an animal anymore. People go, oh, I wouldn't eat that, it's disgusting. But then it doesn't take much. If you tell people the stories, you say, look, try this little piece of liver or whatever, they go, my God, that's really delicious. So to understand your way around an animal, to understand, you know, the hedgerows that you're standing in, to know that you can use the tops of the vegetables, just not the bit, that is very, very, very valuable information. And also, it gives you so many options, and also by really kind of understanding how to cook, you're much more in control of your wallet. And also, it doesn't mean that, you know, to make a leek and potato soup, you can make that in the time it takes the guy to climb on his scooter, put his helmet on, put your hot food in his back and drive it to your house. So, you know, it's so important. And then, but I think, unfortunately, in this country, it's, you know, it's become an argument about class as well. It's all very well for you to say that, you know, you can eat whatever you want, but I'd say, no, it's not about class. Actually, it's about cooking, and it's about knowledge of cooking and the fact that we can all have good things. But you need to cook.
Now, let's stay a little bit on this one. You also told me about the squeaminess. You know, another way of wasting food and throwing away food is we tend to throw away food that we don't like visually. So the ugly vegetable or the food that seems past expiration date. We throw it without even checking it. How can we look at that kind of waste and avoid it? I mean, why, how can we?
The answer is by simply using your senses. I mean, what has happened to us that, what awful thing has happened to us that we cannot use, our sight, our smells, sometimes your hearing, taste. You're just given some instructions on the back. It said, this is no good anymore, chuck it away. So you chuck it away. But why aren't you using, because people, I guess, don't know what to look for anymore. They don't know what the signs are, and they're just doing what they're told blindly. So, that's a real issue. We're not using our kind of, a tactile, visceral sense of, all these, things that you can see whether something's good or not.
So next time we see a jar with marmalade having a spot of mold on it, we just put the spot of mold away and we eat the jar. Yeah.
Scrape it off,
Yeah. I'd like to ask you something that is very much related to a syndrome we have here in Romania, and that is the full fridge syndrome. I don't know if you have it in the UK or not, but here my grandparents, my parents, myself hate to see our fridge empty. And the reason why we hate to see it, because we really had our fridges empty for more than 50 years, I would say, in the old times. So there is, in our psyche, it is empty fridge means poverty, means desperation, means hunger. So what we do, we tend to spend more than 40% of the household income monthly goes on food, and a lot of that food goes wasted. A lot of fruits are being, Romania is in top 10 food waste countries in the world, although we are not in the top 10 affluent countries in Europe. So it's clearly a debalanced situation. At the same time, my son goes to the fridge, he opens it, it's a full fridge, and he thinks he has nothing to eat. On the other hand, I heard you saying that your favorite time of cooking is when your fridge is empty. Explain to me that.
I think, part of the problem, but, firstly, is that, with supermarkets, there are so many offers. I think we rarely know what's in our fridge. And, you go and you buy more and you push it in and the older stuff goes to the back, and then you've bought 3 for the price of 1 and you drink 1 and the other 2. So I think a lot of problems is caused, actually, by not being aware of what's in your fridge, and then all these offers all the time. But when my fridge is empty, that it's a call to action for me. It's it's like I don't really enjoy shopping that much, and so what is in the tins in the cupboard, what's in the bottles, have I got anything fermented in a jar? You just need just that two rashers of dry old bacon, to make that, soup come to life or whatever. So I love it when I have, I think that there's not much in the fridge, because that's a great time of invention. And then, I often quite overlook the freezer, that the fridge is one thing, and then you rummage around in the winter palace of my freezer, and, there'll be a couple of pigeons I shot last summer or whatever it is. So there's always something. And I don't see any shame in using tins or bottles. Some of, it's something the French do so wonderfully well is, kind of beans and jars and stuff. So breadcrumbs, we've all got a half a loaf of bread, kind of going to waste. You can, either kind of, crisp it up and put it on top of a very simple pasta, or you can make a pudding with it, or you could, so there's always options. And very rarely, we've got to be really kind of, it takes me a lot before I'll go shopping, basically. There's always something. It's a time of great invention.
So that's something that we need to bear in mind, because indeed a lot can be done with one potato, right?
A hell of a lot.
Yeah. So look, if you've been very preoccupied and gave a lot of your attention over time and in your work to sustainable eating, for our viewers, for ourselves, for our understanding, that is a concept that is barely starting to take root in Romania. So what is it? What is sustainable eating?
I think that it goes off in many directions. I mean, I think that people always straight away think about food. Packaging is a really big issue for me. I mean, if I go into, I mainly use markets. I shop like a European. My life allows me to kind of, go shopping for food every day, and I will go to the fishmonger to buy fish. And so I'm very, but, going into the supermarket and so many, before you've even talking about the food itself, the packaging is very alarming. There's still things now that say this is currently unrecyclable. Well, why? You were saying that 5 years ago. And I think that comes down to legislation. But the problem with legislation is that you then potentially are saying to people, you are not allowed to make that anymore. And, I don't know whether it's, you become very unpopular. But how come you're still telling me that this is currently unrecyclable when we're also incredibly aware of the problems we're facing, which are only going to get bigger? I think, what I like a system, and I when I was speaking to you yesterday, I think, when you told me about the history of Romania, I think rationing is a very difficult, term to use because it was different here. Hard, but different. And what I like about the idea of food boxes, what I think might becoming increasingly attractive to people, is that food boxes in effect are like companies like Riverford, which is one of the biggest in the UK. It's kind of worked out at what you should be having a week. And with everybody who's got no time, who always wants to look at their phone, or there's still, in the backs of their heads, they're kind of going, I need somebody to do the worrying for me, to do the work about, sustainability. So I like this idea that you could even often offer people an option where you I think that if you want food boxes or veg boxes or meat boxes, you're kind of saying, I want you to do some controls for me. And maybe you could offer people something which is saying, okay, how tight would you like your control? Because if you're really worried about everything that's going on, then let us, take that away from you. And, and here is, the minimum that we think. It doesn't mean you have to eat badly. I think, the flip side of it is that we all eat too much. I mean, a lot of the world, problems could be, kind of if everybody ate less, we don't move as much as we used to. We're not as active. So there's a lot of, health issues here because we're not moving as much. So I think it could, gosh, I'm kind of all out. I've confused myself, but I think there's so much in, we can't have everything we want all the time whenever we want it. But who's going to put their foot down and say, okay, you can't have everything you want all the time. So in the meantime, in the middle, is there some kind of ground where you could kind of opt for a sort of rationing?
But what is a food box? How does it work?
Well, I mean, they originally started in this country as veg boxes. So you will get a box every Monday, which will arrive, and it will have potatoes, and it will have some, greens. It will have some cabbage. It will have some, in the summer, maybe some tomatoes. And that's what you get. And every Monday it turns up, and you can order them in different sizes. Then it was started to be doing with meat boxes. Now you can pretty much get you can get everything, from farmers or organic producers. It comes with very, very little packaging, nor quite often organic. And it's become very popular here.
So and that also means less waste, because you're not buying a kilogram of apples every week and then throw 3/4 away, I guess.
Well, exactly. But also, why would you, again, what you've just said is a great point. Why would you throw the other apples away? You can, make some pickled apples, make a chutney, even put them in your freezer. It's this whole idea that you would throw anything away. And, when I was in Norway, it was in Sweden, that the roots that were being picked in late autumn were then being kept in boxes of earth. And I saw this in a couple of places, and they were withered and they were wrinkly. But when you ate those carrots, they were arguably even better than the carrots earlier in the year because they were kind of more sugary, they were more intensified. But this whole thing, when something doesn't look nice, then we chuck it away. And you kind of want to say to people, my God, you know, travel back 200 years and see what, you know, the conditions of things that people, you know.
My uncle in Transylvania still keeps the carrots in the earth in the winter.
They're very tasty. They get more concentrated.
Absolutely, and sweeter. Yeah, you're right. So that's again, look at the past and what the people who didn't have the abundance of food were doing. Valentine, if you could change one thing only in the food chain today, in order to avoid so much waste and nature savage, what would that be? What would the one thing you would fix?
I think it's children, actually. If you look at all the stories you read your children at nighttime, if you look at all the toys that they play with, the character, 90% of them are animals. And children are born with this default setting to love nature. And as they grow older, they will either stay liking it or they go off it. And they want to get into trainers and, whatever it is. But I think to teach children about nature, and how can anyone do this? You know, you've got a lot of kind of children living in very difficult urban situations. But if you're saying, if I could do anything, if I could scoop them all up at the same time and take them on a wonderful magical walk, pulling things out of hedges and saying, nibble this, or, look at that trout, and this is I think it's so much. I used to go and teach at Jamie Oliver's foundation, and there was some young teenagers, and they'd all have their hoods up and they'd all be on their phones, their earphones, and then I'd walk in and I'm saying, hello, I'm called Valentine, and they'd all look at me like, who is this idiot? But then the minute I tipped, rabbits onto the table and asked them to skin them, the minute I showed them the crayfish with clicking their claws, the minute I said, smell this plant, isn't it weird that it smells like cloves or whatever? You get them, and they take their earphones out and the hoods come down and they turn their phones off. And then by the end of 2 hours, they're all sitting there eating rabbits and boiling crayfish. And I find it heartbreaking that children who are kind of so naturally born to appreciate nature and animals, it would teach them so much. So I think that, keep their little heads in an understanding of the value of what they have. Adults are really good at messing everything up, but
So that's the one thing you would change.
It's a bit kind of naff, but teach the children.
No, not at all. I think this very spot on. I was expecting a more technical answer on the food chain, but I think the answer you offered is more visionary, and because it talks about the future of humanity going forward.
Unfortunately, when children are taught about food now, and they're not really anymore in this country, it's all about salt is really bad for you and you mustn't eat too much of that, and let's make a healthy pizza, and and it's like, oh really, really, is that it? There's so much more to tell them. Don't tell them they shouldn't eat any meat at all. Don't tell them that that salt is bad. Fire them up with imagination rather than giving them a whole list of things, which is going to kill any love of cooking.
Yeah, I have to say you've touched a very, very important subject. Let's stay a little bit on this one. So in your view, in Romania, young modern parenting right now is a lot on don't salt, don't sugar, only bio, quinoa, etc. for everyone, for adults and for kids as well. So what you're saying is, let's not exaggerate. Let's let children know nature first and try nature first before putting barriers to this and that. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, and everything in moderation. But we're not, as we become less moderate. We live in this kind of very unhappy culture. As you said, we live in a culture of unhappiness, and it's always about more, having more. And that's a great shame.
Now, if you were to teach us from all your experience and what you've seen in the world and different cultures and looking back and with your preoccupation, we're not comfortable or used almost at all to take food waste seriously here in Romania. That's really not something. It's now emerging that's what we're trying also to educate and talk about. That's why we're putting this subject on the table. But if you were to offer us 3 hacks on how to avoid food hacks in your household, irrespective of how much money you have, what would you tell us?
What are hacks? I've never really understood this hacking term.
So in the sense of a trick that we would avoid waste, like the one you offer with the peel of the apple.
Well, go and talk to your grandmother straight. Go and talk to your grandmother straight away, and understand what's in your fridge and eat. Eat together. I think the very strange. I think it basically the real answer goes back. It's a very hard question to answer. What 3 things? I think the first one would be go back to your grandmother and really understand what's in your fridge. I think where you're from. Because I've talked to you and Florin. Romania is a big place, and it's only Transylvania that I've looked at, and I imagine that it's the same as everywhere else. The young want to leave. They want something which they see as more exciting, as more as they being tempted away by Instagram. But what I think is so amazing, and it might be very patronizing, it might be an overly romantic and sentimental idea, is that Transylvania particularly gets talked about as a place where is holding on to something which is extremely valuable, which is kind of as there is still a respect for the very fragile systems between humans and the natural world before we've taken all the pins out. So I think, for the people there, it's, there's something, people are looking at you, and, who exactly, and it doesn't solve all the problems, but you've got something to be incredibly proud of.
That's true, but we don't seem to appreciate, like with everything in life, I think.
Well, because we all want an Apple computer and Nike trainers, and I don't know what it is, but I can't talk, because while I'm here talking to you, I would like to add, just to put a little bit of kind of temperance in the whole thing, is it's all very well for me to say this to you, but the problem with modern life is that while you're trying to save that beetle, to get to that beetle, you've got to tread on that flower. So the problem is that we all contradict ourselves every single day. And, one can be very kind of preachy, which I really try not to be. And I'm a hypocrite fundamentally, because I fail every day in one way or another.
Valentine, many families today don't eat together anymore at all. Most on the occasions when they do, there's another person sitting with them at the table, and that is the phone, like another member of the family. Lack of time, stressful life, these seem to be the regular motives given to this accelerated alienation, I would call it. So if you were to look at the family like that, which is a prototype for a lot of families in your country, in my country as well today, if you would look at such a family and you would try to help them in regaining their energy together in the sense of family around food, what would you tell them to do? Where should they start regaining the idea of a family around food?
It's really hard, that, because it's based on so many things, but I guess, turn your telephones off. But I don't know if what would I say? I don't know. I don't know if I can answer that one really, but the way I'm used to it is normally people, is normally cooking for people who've decided that they want to eat together already. But if you're, so the best example I can use is where I work in Norway. The people who come up to Norway to eat and stay there, none of them know each other. They don't know each other at all. They all come with their their own worries, their own lives, their own, personalities, whatever the case may be. So I think the closest I can get is that none of these people know each other. And we sit them next to each other and in the hope that it'll work well. But the minute you start, I don't tend to plate up food when I'm not there. I don't do it restaurant style. I put things down the middle of the table. And I do that on purpose, because what happens is people start to pick stuff up and offer it to the person next to them. And then the eating starts, and then there may be a little bit of drinking. And before you know it, you can hear a very silent beginning where the chairs are shuffling on the first night and everyone's kind of, politely asking. And then very, very quickly, this kind of amazing volume comes, and it's the kind of the click of the spoons and the forks. It's the, it's the pouring of wine, and then this wonderful chat. It gets quite noisy. So while I can't answer your question about what I would say to families, what I do know is that, when I'm feeding strangers, the offering food to each other, and, wonderful things happen with groups of people sitting around a table with food placed in the middle of them.
But that's a very good answer. In fact, I was thinking, if you would ask me the same question, that's using your example, it means that I would talk to the mother of that family to just cook something, put it in the middle of the table, and probably eventually, little by little, the rest of the family will come around and start to eat together if the phones are switched off. So it's a very good answer. Thank you. The last one obviously has to be about you and your children. So we talked so much about food, the relationship with nature, and the relationship to cooking food and understanding nature. So as a parent to your kids, cooking is an act of love. Food is nature indoors. What is your contribution to how your children are thinking about food and nature?
While it hurts me hugely that my children don't live with me, while it causes me great sadness that my children live in another country, the good parts of that are the fact that I owe a lot to my parents, simply for the fact that where I was brought up, which was in Dorset in the southwest of England during the 70s, the best place to play was outside. And we lived on a farm. So although my father was a diplomat, he was a dairy farmer as well. And he was very, very excited by picking mushrooms. And, we drank the milk. My brother and I, used to go and get the milk every night, probably drop some Lego into the milk tank. And, very quickly, and my father kind of, the trees were filled with chattering hedgerow spirits and everything was animated. And very quickly, I began to myself, and I think that I was always going to end up being a cook, although I trained as an artist, is that I divided the food, the world and people actually between edible or inedible.
And people.
I'm telling you this is because my children are growing up in the Pyrenees. So everything we've talked about, they are in the middle of. There's a very, while Spain has become very famous for its, food and chefs, this part of the Pyrenees, like any other part of Spain, there's not a lot of variety of choice there. But what is very clear is, where the food is on the whole. There's problems already, like the pig farming there, which breaks my heart every time I go there. But, Spain is about community. It's about having, the grandparents normally there as well. It's about eating what immediately kind of grows or that area is famous for, and living in nature. So, I have my problems when the children come home. My son will run in the other direction of, vegetables particularly. So you have to kind of trick children. My Minnie said, I had some partridges which I'd shot. And I just thought, all right, I'm going to try these out on the kids. So Minnie said, well, what is that, Daddy? And I wasn't going to say it's a partridge. So I just said, it's a hedge chicken. And so you have to kind of trick children slightly, or cook them something that they do like and mix it up with the things they don't like. But you know, my children, Minnie is very unsqueamish. She will try absolutely anything. And Louis is a little bit more difficult, but they're growing up in a place where they are surrounded by nature. They can see that, you know, what is outside comes indoors. You know, everyone there has allotments where they grow tomatoes, wonderful tomatoes or peppers or corn. So they're growing up in what I would call, on the whole, a good food environment. And it's also, you know, as very family-centric people who look after their elderly, I think much more than we do in the UK. It's a good place to eat because it is about being round at the table. It's quite often there's, you know, other people there and they're living in nature. So I don't worry so much for them at the moment until it gets to a point where I can say, you know, if you can't cook, darling, you're not a grown-up.
That's a fantastic closure. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful interview. And I use the word wonderful not because we reinvented the wheel, but because of the sincerity and the humanism of the conversation, which I felt along our exchange. There's one little final question I need to ask.
Just say, just before, you know, the one before your one little is the problem with this is that it's not just about food. You know, it becomes about, you know, it becomes about wages. It becomes about politics. It becomes about big business who are very interested in selling, you know, kind of cheap and not great food. It's about so many things. So I don't want to be seen. I've probably annoyed a few people who might hear this and hopefully have made others happy. But it's a big subject, you know, food. It's something that's integral. It's absolutely essential to all our lives. But it's something that one can talk for years and months about. It's something that gets people very heated as much as, you know, as other subjects. So it's a political, difficult, you have, I haven't kind of mess. And it's very, very, very hard to unpick. So I'm kind of saying this to anyone watching, that if I've come across as preachy, I really hope I haven't. If I've come across with, you know, I hope not to annoy, but it's a complicated subject. And, you know, there have been wars about food in the past. And, you know, it's a complicated subject.
Absolutely. Well, the mission Juana and myself have taken at with this program, with Habits by Republica, is to put subjects like this on the table, because there's so much that we believe can happen if people just talk about subjects rather than ignore them or just don't even think about them. My little last question was, why were you putting Lego in the milk tank?
Well, because we were very small and we always had, you know, Star Wars figures in our pockets or Legos. So I used to hold my brother by the legs and he would have his little churn and he would hop up and then I'd hold him by the legs and he'd have to reach right in. So that's why I said, you know, there's probably a bit of Lego fell out. You know, it was a silly thing to say. No, because that it ties very much to your point before, that children love to explore nature and food also, and they see food as a toy also sometimes, and that's good. That's very good. That's education, right? Children have a natural affinity. Yeah. Well, anyway, that's another.
Well, thank you so much for a very, very wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed. I hope you did too.
And I hope to be joining you for a woodland walk with a basket, picking mushrooms sometime this October.
And making zakuska. Thank you very much. Thank you. Vă mulțumim că ne-ați urmărit, sperăm că v-a fost de folos și vă invităm în comunitatea noastră a Societății Omului Sănătos.